Hello there and welcome back to the studio. I hope you had a wonderful day yesterday. In today's episode, we're going to be painting this portrait that we're observing here. And the photo reference for this portrait of the horse was taken in yesterday's video. So yesterday's video, if you missed yesterday's video, it was a pretty fun adventure. And I think I'm going to film more of these expeditions. I want to bring the life of the artist along with the show. As I mentioned before, I really want this to be about the experience. And of course, there's much more to a painter than painting. There's a lot that goes into, even the psychology of the direction of the brushstroke and all of that stuff. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to be putting in a simple block in, and I'm just using a little bit of the water and the burnt umber. Oh yes, and by the way, I am using the water mixable oil paints once again. So I did add an extra blue. If you're looking in the corner, I added cobalt blue. I really needed kind of a more saturated blue than the ultramarine, and it's from the same brand, the Winsor and Newton. And if you're new to this channel and you want to know exactly what materials I'm using, you can feel free to scroll down to the description box down below, and I'll have all that stuff typed out for you. So I'm starting out kind of putting in the simple shape for the ears, and like I say in each video, it's about creating a painting and not a picture, because the camera already did its job. The photograph is nice enough. I really don't feel like I want to recreate the photograph. I'm going to let the photograph be a photograph, and let this be a painting. That being said, I do have a simple shape. It's almost like a rectangle for the head, and I have basically two triangle looking shapes for the ears, and just dots for the eyes, and just a little axis mark. And you'll see later on, actually, you will use a center line for the direction of the horse's head. And here I am trying to get that angle. It's still not quite right. But then again, I'm not going to create a perfectly finished linear block in. It's just my style these days. I like to have a loose sketch with burnt umber or raw sienna or whichever color, and then build onto that loose sketch with simple masses of color. So I'm really starting to learn more and more each day now how much consistency of water to paint to use. So as you'll notice, the paint isn't really dripping off as much. So there's definitely a learning curve when you're using the water mixable oil paints. And again, I'm just using the water mixable oil paints for, there are many reasons, but the main reason is it's just more affordable for me right now. And that's not to say that, I'm just using it because it's cheaper, but it actually handles really, really nicely when you get used to it. And like I've been saying in the past few days, the water mixable oil paint, in particular from the Winsor and Newton, there goes that center line. So notice how I'm following that center line and really trying to get the angle by eye, just freehand drawing that center line, and that gives me the overall dynamic movement of the pose of the horse that we're drawing. And notice that all of, like, the way I'm guiding you through this is very much the same as if I were to guide you through another portrait painting of a human. Which, don't worry, those will come back. We'll do another portrait painting of a human soon. But, it's the same kind of language that we're using. And again, I was just talking about the water mixable oil paint. So this brand in particular that I'm using, the Winsor Newton Artisan water mixable oil paints, has a pretty bad reputation with most of the artists that I've met. So to me, it's kind of the underdog, and I tend to favor the underdog, so to speak. Meaning I tend to really, latch onto those or those things that are not that, popular. And they really have been surprising me. Now you see how quickly and flawlessly I mixed up that color value web, which is a telltale sign. Now, it's only been 5 minutes, but we're ready to jump into these large color masses. And remember, a mass is just basically a blob of paint. So there are two ways you can approach the drawing. You can approach it linearly or via mass. And so oil paint and of course water mixable oil paint included really lends itself to working with mass, and that is because it stays wet for a very, very long time. But there are other techniques that you can use, such as the alla prima wet on wet technique with oil paint, which is what we're going to be using with the water mixables. Though I'm going to be using an altered version of the traditional wet on wet approach. So traditionally wet on wet in oil paint, you want to use a less medium first, and then increase the amount of medium because thinner paint tends to stick onto thicker paint. With these water mixables, and I'll tell you what, I'm using a 11 by 14 inch cotton canvas, nothing fancy, just acrylic primed, the basics. Okay, just to give you some some context in terms of what surface I'm painting on. Nothing special. Everything here is very, very inexpensive. So I found that having a little bit more water in the first layer of the wet on wet approach, so that is the ears are on their first layer already, the top of the hair is on its first layer already. Having a little bit more water allows it to settle in, and it gets kind of sticky, which is a property that a lot of folks don't like, that I didn't like before, but it's something you just get used to. Okay, so using more water in this this pass, it'll start to get sticky in maybe like, I don't know, 15 or 20 minutes, maybe less. And then that's when I go into the smaller shapes, such as the eyes and the nose and the fur and all of that. But the idea here is to use large brushes and basically paint the large shapes, the large masses. And like I said earlier, there are two ways to look at it, right? Line and mass. We started out with line very simply. So with line, you can think of it kind of like a coloring book with a perfectly finished outline. You just go and color it in. But the interesting thing is with mass, you can fill in a very large shape. See how we're filling in these large shapes? Super, super simple large shape. And then with the surrounding shapes, we get to basically mold the shapes into more specificity, like a block of clay. And again, oil paint lends itself to this kind of way of working because it's so versatile, it's so forgiving, it enables us to do that. Now, if I were working in something that would dry much more quickly, tell you the truth, I wouldn't have a clue how to approach it, but I don't think that this is the approach that you would use for like a watercolor or acrylic or something like that. That being said, I'm never going to tell you, I'm not someone that's going to tell you, you must follow this, you must do that. You can see, if you've been following my videos long enough, you can see that I change techniques, I change a lot. And I think it's important to add as much variety into your work as possible and not get too caught up in, one perfect formula or one thing that will always work all the time, every time, because that can be kind of, I don't know, not as much fun. In any case, notice how we're pushing the warmth of the colors. Now the photograph was taken in, I forget, it was like 10 in the morning or something like that in the shade. So the colors are pretty cool. And that is like kind of bluish, but you know me, I like to push the warmth in the colors. It's just my style these days. And so I am leaning a little more heavily towards the umbers, the burnt umber and the raw sienna. And we're just going to put in a simple dark mask for the nose. And like I've been saying in the past few days, I'm working on white just because I just feel like the water mixables don't really have the strength the strength and the pigment as much as the traditional oil paints, at least in my opinion. Again, I haven't done any kind of scientific tests towards it, but now you see, I just mixed up the titanium white, the ultramarine blue, and the cadmium yellow. Had that been the traditional oil paints, it would probably be much more chromatic, much brighter. But that's not to say that's a negative thing. Um, with the water mixables, you can even see the water dripping off the corner of the brush. If you're watching this in 1080p and HD, you can really see the texture of the kind of the fluidity of the brush stroke and texture of the canvas. But in any case, I'm working on the white surface just because I wanted to help to push a little bit more of the chroma. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not that happy with the cobalt blue. Oh, by the way, that was cobalt blue, titanium white, and cadmium yellow medium. It still isn't quite bright enough. And again, that's not the fault of the paint. I think that's just the nature of that particular paint. I'm probably going to I might keep the cobalt blue on my palette because it is much more chromatic than the ultramarine blue in the higher values. Ultramarine blue is a little more chromatic, I think, in the darker values, just because, it's a darker value on its own. But working on the white surface also is going to enable me to push the values a little bit further than if I were working on a neutral ground. Now, the nice thing about working on a tone is that it helps your darks look dark and your lights look light. So if you're new to oil painting, I wouldn't really recommend working on white. I would recommend working on a neutral gray tone, and you can achieve that very simply by just neutral gray acrylic paint, toning your canvas, and you're good. Working on the white, however, you really want to utilize the white of the canvas, and by utilizing it, I'm going to be leaving the white patch of the horse's fur untouched until I'm ready to go into it with the titanium white and a little bit of the ultramarine blue. And we're approaching the halfway point in today's episode. So, like I've mentioned in the past couple days, I am doing this voiceover style. So you're listening to me watching the footage. It's almost like we're watching the footage together, and I'm guiding you along with the footage. So I won't fill the entire thing up with talk. So I will leave some momentary pauses. So you can watch the painting footage without hearing my voice all the time. And like I mentioned, I'm pushing the warmth in the colors, so you can see it. I just threw alizarin crimson in the background. Like, obviously, you can tell I'm not trying to replicate the photograph at all. And I'm painting with a lot of freedom. You can tell. I'm not that worried about trying to get the perfect little outside shape, or trying to color match anything, or none of that. I'm really just enjoying the process. I'm really just enjoying filling in all of these large shapes. And now we're starting to push some of the halftones a little further. So I didn't notice it when I was painting it, but there it is. So I am painting, I think now, multiple layers, wet on wet. The past few days I would only do maybe 2 layers, but I just noticed that, yeah. So apparently I'm starting to add multiple layers, wet on wet. And the nice thing, like I mentioned before, is that these brush strokes will start to get sticky. They'll start to get a little bit tacky. Not necessarily drying, but they'll start to get kind of gooey, which will enable me to add more and more layers. It's really cool. It's kind of a mixture between like acrylic and traditional oil paint. And so we're using just ultramarine blue. I would have really loved to have a dioxazine purple. I'm gonna have to go to the store and pick myself up a purple. And I'm going to edit the branch, the wooden thing that the horse is leaning its head on. Excuse me, the railing of the fence. You know what I mean? That wooden thing that the horse is leaning on. I'm gonna edit it. So I'm gonna let it go all the way down. See that? So I'm gonna let it go all the way down just because compositionally, I don't know. I think it just looks a little bit better in my opinion. And I'll focus on the top portion of that railing later on. Now we're throwing in a little bit of sap green, pretty much just pure sap green into the background. And then that sap green with a little bit of the bluish mixtures that we had before. You can really see the textures showing through in the background. That's a very distinct water mixable oil paint texture that I'm starting to notice. It's pretty neat, I think. And those of you that are into saving money and not sacrificing quality, yeah, these water mixables are really affordable, and the quality of the color is really, really nice. Had I been using much more expensive colors, like I'm not going to name any brands, but had I been using more expensive colors, you may not be able to tell the difference unless you see it in person with very, sharp light or something like that. Pull out a microscope or something. I'm just kidding. And you can see now the wet on wet approach. So the new layer is starting to stick onto the older layer quite nicely, but it also allows me to modulate the edges. So this is very interesting because I'm able to build like an acrylic painting when I want to, and then kind of blend, excuse me, and kind of blend like an oil painting when I want to. When I want to layer like an acrylic painting, I use more water. It starts to get tacky. I layer on with another kind of watery layer. When I want to blend, like you're seeing right there, there you go, like that, exactly like that. So when I want to blend like traditional oils, just less water, more paint, and it does the job quite nicely. And it'll get tacky, yes, but it'll get tacky at a slower rate, which is what you're seeing now. I'm starting to get much more of the subtlety in the halftones of the horse, and we're even starting to get some of the effects of the fur. And this is all happening very, very fast. This is allowing me to paint very fast because of that tackiness, the fact that it's sticking and allowing the paint to grip onto the surface. And we're using a little bit of the cadmium red. See that? I'm definitely pushing the color the way I want to push the color. Okay, so now we just switched brushes. That is it's a clean brush. It's a synthetic bristle mix. It's a Princeton Catalyst polytip bristle, size, I don't know, I think 10. It's a weird name. The name of it is an Egbert brush. Notice how long the bristles are. Now you're seeing how I'm going to utilize the white of the canvas. So I did use a little bit of what's left of my cobalt blue and the titanium white, and I'm starting to put in that tone over top of the blank canvas that I left. So this is one way you can really utilize the white of the canvas. And even if it was toned, if it was if I toned the canvas gray like I do with traditional oils, or if I toned it in some kind of value, I would really have to use a much more paint, probably even like palette knife, to get the value that I'm getting with the white of the horse's fur. And it's a really interesting thing to wonder if the titanium white in the oil paint is lighter than the white of the gesso. I'm not sure, but I think they're pretty much the same, if you would ask me. And now, with the same brush, just throwing in a little bit of the cooler color from the palette mixed in with the warmer color of the palette, putting in some, we're putting in some softer edges. And so when I want to blend in that way, meaning when I want to soften edges, I just increase the amount of paint that I use. Now we're starting to put in a little bit more of a half tone underneath of the horse's mouth. And just kind of putting in a little more of a middle ground there. I do admit that I think that was a mistake. I should have had more water just to get the paint to stick a little more. I don't know. That just wasn't the value that I wanted. And there you can see me trying to reconcile that shape. Now, excuse me. Now we're starting to put in the smaller shapes. Now you can see how that brushstroke is sticking onto the canvas panel. See that? It's pretty magical, if you ask me. And I really wouldn't have expected this kind of quality, and I'm going to keep saying this. I really wouldn't have expected this kind of quality from the Winsor Newton Artisan water mixables. And no, I'm not paid to say this. No one's paying me to tell you how I feel. Excuse me. No one's paying me to tell you how I feel about any particular brand or anything like that. So I'm telling you the truth. And even if someone was paying me, I would give you a fair and honest review without any bias. But anyway, now you can really see the trick is to put in a little bit less of the water. I know this might sound strange, but a little bit less of the water when you want to kind of have a softer edge, a smoother edge. There you go. So that is pretty much just straight paint. I'm pretty sure that's just burnt umber, ultramarine blue, and alizarin crimson. So getting that highlight right there. So that brushstroke was achieved by putting in more water to the titanium white and a little bit of cobalt blue. And I'm starting to notice, see that? So I'm starting to notice that the water mixables can handle like the traditional oil paints, like thinner will stick over top of thicker. So thinner paint does stick over top of thicker paint. See that? But here's the trick though. It only sticks when the paint is not tacky. And if the paint gets tacky, it'll still stick. It's just that, what am I trying to say here? What I'm trying to say is the way that the brushstrokes are layering. Honestly, I'm really impressed at the way that these paints are handling. And that's why I'm at a loss for words, because the advantage is that the paint dries slowly, just like traditional oil paints, but it has this very tactile aspect to it that is baffling me. That's why I'm at a loss for words. I'm doing this voiceover style, so I'm watching the footage after the fact, and I'm at a loss for words because the way that it's handling is very, very user friendly for me. Now, in terms of the shapes, um, it's a little different, or should I say, it's extremely different to painting a portrait of a human, or of if you were to do a cast drawing or something like that. Um, light and shadow almost isn't really. I'm not that worried about it. I know that the ears were in shadow, the bottom right here is dark. I'm not that worried about light and shadow, or the things that I would worry about in a traditional style painting. Rather, I'm just going in for masses of color, just simple shapes of color. And see how the bottom was dripping? See how wet the paint was? Those are drip marks, right? Now watch how I can paint right, well, when I get to it, you can see how it's sticking, like how the paint is layering. And I'm just so fascinated with that. I really am, especially after watching this footage after the fact. It's just astounding that it layers so nicely. And another trick really is to transition into softer and softer brushes. The more you want to layer wet on wet. There we go. Now you're going to see it. See that? And you can almost see how, the layer underneath is still evident, right? It's weird how it sticks. It's very, very tacky. You can see it with the darker brushstroke. There it is. I could do this all day. And in fact, I do this all day. And I really want to present all of these experiences to you. And believe me, I'm very impressed with the way that the paint is handling. Look how that, and that color, I should talk more about the color mixtures, huh? So I'm pretty sure that's ivory black, alizarin crimson, and just that, because I was trying to push the contrast a little bit more. Traditionally, I would have thrown in like a little bit of burnt umber or something, but no. Pretty sure that was just ivory black and alizarin. See that? Now how the paint is starting to stick on. But if I use too much water, I did use too much water. So the layer underneath is starting to get wet again. So the layer underneath, see, you can still kind of see on the left side of that canvas a little bit of the white of the canvas showing through in the darker areas. But on the right side of the darker area, you can see I layered it a little bit better. So you're not seeing the too much of the white of the canvas showing through. And I would really recommend you watch this in 1080p. So, just go into the little info thing on the side of the video. You have the option to watch this video in higher quality. And I think in the 1080p, you'll really get to see how nicely the paint is layering. And here we have a little close-up shot of the palette. Oh yes, so I did something kind of interesting here. So to get the effects of the fur, the darker areas of the fur, and we only have about a minute left here, so this is going to be really quick. So a dark brush and a light brush, right? You're seeing me make the mixtures, just titanium white, pretty much just yellow ochre. I'm holding two brushes, right? Check this out. This is going to be cool, I think. Knowing that the paint is going to layer quite nicely, boom. I'm holding two brushes. That's right. I'm holding two brushes at once. And I have never done this before. Who paints holding two brushes at once? I don't know. Question of the day. Have you ever done something like that? Alright, so now the last thing to do is just to throw a signature onto this, and then we're going to call it done. And just the water and a little bit of burnt umber. See how thin the paint is, okay? It's very, very thin, right? And you'll see how nicely it'll stick onto the initial wash. Super simple. And there you have it. That being said, I really do hope that today's video helps you out. I hope that maybe you learned something new about water mixable oil paints. That being said, in a world that can be so negative, be the spark that ignites positivity amongst all of us. I really do hope that you have a wonderful day, and I'll be back again very soon.